Did you say there was a quiz coming up? What did you
Yeah,
say?
after we
When?
finish the so
What day?
we'll be on chapter 1, chapter 2, and this review. So all the stuff I have taught so far.
Okay.
After 3 classes later, but because we're going to take 3 times to finish this. Right, so, Makita, I think I need this projector to be on. Hello? Where? Hello? Yeah, you guys there?
Yeah, we're back.
Okay, so should I push this on or not? Is
Yeah,
this
turn this one on. On this side?
here? Power?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, how about this one? Should I click this on too?
We got it.
You got it, this one?
Yeah.
People fear globalization and the benefits. Others welcome it. Millions of people today are better off than they would have been. As the 20th century drew to its close and our new century began, the battle over the world economy intensified. Some people feared globalization and questioned the benefits. Others welcomed it. Millions of people today are better off than they would have been without those trends and developments, without globalization. And very few people have been harmed by it. When the terrible events of September 11th seemed likely to drive the world deeper into a recession, new questions emerged about the perils of the new world economy. How can our now deeply interconnected world cope with a global downturn and rise above other crises?
This is not clear.
As the 20th century drew to its close and our new century began, the battle over the world economy intensified. Some people feared globalization and questioned the benefits. Others welcomed it. Millions of people today are better off than they would have been without those trends and developments, without globalization. And very few people have been harmed by it. As the terrible events of September 11th drove the world deeper into a recession, new questions emerged about the perils of the new world economy. Can our now deeply interconnected world surmount a global downturn and rise above other crises? And is global terrorism the dark side of the promise of globalization?
You can't get away from the fact that globalization
This
makes
is
us
clear,
interdependent.
but it's small.
So it's not an option to shed it. So is
Do
it going
you
to be on
guys
balance
prefer
positive or
this
negative?
one or the YouTube?
Try maximize.
This is the story of how the new global economy
Can't do
was
the
born.
maximize here.
A century-long battle
At the
as to
top
which
near
would
the,
control the commanding heights
yeah,
of the
that-
world's economies, governments
Volkswagen.
or markets. The story of intellectual combat over which economic system would truly benefit mankind. The story of epic political struggles.
Do you prefer this one or prefer earlier? Bigger picture, but it's less clear. It's your call.
Bigger.
Bigger one.
Yeah.
Now it's frozen.
Can't you change the resolution on YouTube to like
Of
1080?
nations and will determine the future of the planet.
I will try
This new world economy is being driven by technological change and by political change, but none of it would have happened without a revolution in ideas.
Tonight, the battle of ideas that's
Mark with the A and then the ring around it.
At?
See, that's what I said. Kate.
Roll into the new year in a new Nissan during Nissan's 2015 event. Choose from 15 models with 0% financing for up to 60 months. Shop at your local Nissan store or choose Nissan.com.
This time seems better, right?
As the 20th century drew to its close and our new century began, the battle over the world economy. People feared globalization and questioned the benefits. Others welcomed it.
Billions of people today are better off than they would have been without those trends and developments, without globalization. And very few have been harmed by it.
When the terrible events of September 11th seemed likely to drive the world deeper into a recession, new questions emerged about the perils of the new world economy. How can our now deeply interconnected world cope with a global downturn and rise above other crises? And is global terrorism the dark side of the promise of globalization?
Can't get away from the fact that globalization makes us interdependent. So it's not an option to shed it. So is it going to be on balance positive or negative?
This is the story of how the new global economy was
Can you
born.
guys hear it?
A century-long battle as to which would control the commanding heights of the world's economy. Governments or markets. The story of intellectual combat over which economic system would truly benefit mankind. The story of epic political struggles to implant those ideas on the nations of the world.
Part of what's happened is a capitalist revolution. At the end of the 20th century, the market economy, the capitalist system, became the only model for the vast majority of the world.
This economic revolution has defined the wealth and fate of nations and will determine the future of the planet.
This new world economy is being driven by technological change and by political change, but none of it would have happened without a revolution in ideas.
Tonight, the battle of ideas that still divides our world.
This program was made possible by
EDS, offering business and technology solutions from strategy and implementation to hosting. EDS, managing the complexities of the digital economy.
FedEx. Frugality may be new to some, but to us, it's the way we do business.
We're reinventing the energy business as we develop American oil and gas, next generation clean fuels, and renewables like solar power. We're the people of BP.
Additional funding was provided by the Pew Charitable Trusts, the John Templeton Foundation, the Smith Richardson Foundation, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
World War II. Sirens sound the alert. German bombers will pound another British city tonight. During the Blitz, the two most important economists of the age shared air warden duty on the roof of King's College. An English gentleman and an Austrian exile, personal friends, but intellectual rivals. How their battle of ideas still shapes our life and society is our story. John Maynard Keynes helped the Allied governments defend freedom by planning their wartime economies. Friedrich von Hayek thought government interference in the economy was a threat to freedom.
The debate over market forces, whether you have an economy that's based upon prices or state planning, has been at the very heart of the economic battles of the last 100 years. For decades, the ideas of John Maynard Keynes dominated the economies of the Western world.
Keynes felt that the market economy would go to excesses, and when things were in difficulty, the market wouldn't work. Therefore, the government had to step in. Hayek felt that the market would eventually take care of itself.
It was only when Hayek was a very old man that his ideas began to prevail and the world began to change.
At the start of the 20th century, Hayek and Keynes had witnessed the first age of globalization. Every day, life was being transformed everywhere. Technologies like the telegraph and the telephone revolutionized communications. Steamships and railways made the world a smaller place. Tens of millions migrated without the need for passports. Keynes described this global market in which trade flowed freely.
The inhabitant of London could order by telephone, sipping his morning tea, the various products of the whole earth, and reasonably expect their early delivery upon his doorstep. Militarism and imperialism, of racial and cultural rivalries, were little more than the amusements of his daily newspaper. What an extraordinary episode in the economic progress of man was that age which came to an end in August 1914.
Hayek summed it up more succinctly.
We did not realize how fragile our civilization was.
The murder of an Austrian archduke by a terrorist triggered a world war. It would be almost 80 years before there was once again a truly global economy. World War I destroyed 20 million lives. It laid a whole continent to waste. There was blood and carnage amidst the beauty of the Italian Alps, where the armies of Austria and Italy were fighting. Friedrich von Hayek served in the Austrian artillery. He was only 17 years old, still a schoolboy. The fighting was ferocious. He experienced retreat and defeat.
The decisive influence was really World War I. It's bound to draw your attention to the problems of political organization.
He vowed to work for a better world.
The First World War was a cataclysm. People were disillusioned, people were bitter, they were looking for something better. Socialism, communism seemed to promise that better world.
By overthrowing the old order, the Russian Revolution aimed to deliver that better world. Inspired by the economic theories of Karl Marx, the Bolsheviks sought to smash capitalism. Lenin, the revolution's leader, urged the workers of the world to unite against the global economy. The revolution made trade, commerce, and private property criminal acts. Lenin promised to end the economic exploitation of man by man. The man who was destined to be Hayek's great intellectual rival was a brilliant young academic at Cambridge University. But John Maynard Keynes was much more than that. He befriended writers and artists. One painted these murals for him. He was also a familiar figure in the city of London, where he made a fortune in the stock market, lost it all, and made it back again. Familiar with politicians and prime ministers, Keynes spent the First World War advising the British government on how to organize its wartime economy. At the end of the war, Keynes joined the British peace delegation at Versailles in France. The victorious Allies wanted defeated Germany to pay the costs of the war through what were called reparations.
All the statesmen at Versailles could think about was how to squeeze money out of an already bankrupt Germany.
Keynes felt that the reparations were out of all proportion to what an economy could really take and would have very destructive social and political and economic consequences.
Angry and disgusted, Keynes resigned. Back in England, he went to stay with his friend, the painter Duncan Grant. That summer, Grant painted Keynes, writing his prophetic book, The Economic Consequences of the Peace.
If we take the view that Germany must be kept impoverished and her children starved and crippled, vengeance, I dare predict, will not limp. Nothing can delay that final war that will destroy the civilization and progress of our generation.
Austria had lost the war and its empire. Vienna was a cold and hungry city. Revolution was in the air. Socialists and communists were winning the battle for hearts and minds. Young and idealistic, Friedrich von Hayek enrolled at the University of Vienna.
It was during the war that I more or less decided to do economics. I really got hooked.
Socialism seemed to promise a more just society. Albert Zlevinger, a former pupil and disciple of Hayek.
He openly said that he at one time was a socialist of the mild sort, where concerns for the poor and concerns for fairness and equity would help to determine government policy.
Much of Vienna's intellectual life took place outside the university, in the coffee houses, across the Ringstrasse. There were informal seminars for those who loved discussion and argument. Hayek joined the circle of a passionate libertarian called Ludwig von Mises. Von Mises believed markets, like people, needed to be free from government meddling.
Ludwig von Mises was the preeminent economist of the Austrian school. The distinguishing hallmark of the Austrian school of economic thought is that markets work and governments don't.
Von Mises predicted that the new Soviet socialist economy would never work, precisely because the government controlled wages and prices.
What von Mises said is that the great flaw of socialism is that it doesn't have a functioning price system to send all the signals to consumers and producers as to what something is worth. That these prices are at the very heart of what makes a functioning economy work. You can think of them as traffic signals. And if you don't have them, what you get is a system that doesn't work, or you get chaos.
Mises argued that free markets do it best. Why fool with anything else?
In Soviet Russia, it seemed as if von Mises' predictions were coming true. Lenin had abolished what he saw as the chaos of free markets. The state controlled the economy. Wages and prices were fixed. But the great Marxist experiment was in trouble. Lenin had an economic disaster on his hands. Soviet Russia was a grim place, haunted by cold, famine, hunger, and death.
Lenin knew that he needed a different kind of policy, and he instituted what became known as the New Economic Policy. Lenin says farmers can sell their own goods and own their own land. He says that small businesses can operate, and you start to get an economic revival. Well, his comrades on the left attacked him viciously for selling out the principles of Bolshevikism and Marxism. And Lenin, who by this time had already had a stroke, was not well, nevertheless pulled himself up on the platform for one of the very last times in his life. And he was still the old Lenin. He was vitriolic, he was sarcastic. His critics, he said, were fools, were stupid, because the state, the government, the Bolsheviks would control the overall economy. Steel, railroads, coal, the heavy industries, what he called the commanding heights of the economy.
Within a year, Lenin was dead. The mourners at Lenin's funeral believed that history was on their side. And in less than 30 years, not only Russia, but Eastern Europe, China, more than a third of humanity would be living according to the economic tenets of Marxist-Leninism. Lenin's successor would tighten the Communist Party's iron grip on the commanding heights of the economy. Joseph Stalin introduced central planning. Under him, the Communist Party planned and managed every aspect of the economy. While communism seemed to be forging ahead, capitalism looked to be doomed. Germany and Austria were living with the economic consequences of the peace. Forced to pay unbearable war reparations, the defeated governments simply printed more money. The result? Inflation. More inflation. Hyperinflation. It took a basket full of paper money to go shopping.
You saw people
carrying their money on wheels because you had to pay for a piece of bread billions of Reichsmark.
Hayek, who was working at a statistical research institute, needed 200 pay raises in 8 months. Money was cheaper than wallpaper. Million-mark notes lit stoves. Shoes that cost 12 marks in 1913 sold for 32 trillion marks in 1923. In Hitler's favorite beer keller, a glass of beer cost 1 billion marks. Hyperinflation wiped out the savings of the middle class.
And that was one of the reasons for the success of the Nazis, of Hitler. They got support from these people who lost their fortunes.
Hayek would always see inflation as an evil that corroded society and undermined democracy. The fight against inflation became a cornerstone of his economic philosophy.
During the 1920s, while Europe was continuing to suffer the wounds of the First World War, in American cities at least, it was a boom time. Americans were spending money, they were dancing, they were partying, they were buying cars, they were buying bathtub gin, and they were buying stock, lots of stock. The stock market, the New York Stock Exchange, had become a national pastime. Americans couldn't get enough of it. And the favorite stock of the day were in these new radio companies. Radio was like the internet of the 1920s, an industry that had come from nowhere. And the number one glamour stock was RCA, which in just a few years went from $1.50 a share to $600 a share. Americans couldn't get enough of it.
It was a classic stock market bubble. Then, on Black Thursday, October 24th, 1929, the bubble burst. Prices plunged. The downward spiral proved unstoppable. Eight hours after the market had closed, the ticker tape machines were still tapping out the bad news. The stock market crash started America's slide into despair.
During the 30s here, it was a complete and utter collapse. From the people's point of view, it was despair as values and prices spiraled ever onward, downward. It left them with no ability to earn, no ability to repay, no ability to spend, no ability to consume. Everything went down. The farm implement sale, the clothing store, the merchant. Everything spiraled downward, and of course with it went the banks.
People panicked. They rushed to withdraw their hard-earned savings.
Run on a bank means lines through the lobby and out the front door and down around the block. People waiting day and night to get up to see if they could withdraw their cash.
The millions that could not lost everything.
If you look at the period of time from 29 on, about half the banks in the United States closed.
the government failed to halt the downward spiral. In fact, it made things worse.
Private construction virtually ceases. Mills and factories shut down. Railroads come to a virtual standstill. Millions of Americans, men, women, and children, wait in the cold, on bread lines, in soup kitchens. 3 million Americans are ex-wage earners, unemployed. And the ranks of the unemployed ought to soar to 15 million.
Banks collapsed. Industry ground to a stop. Millions were out of work. In Britain, working men, many of them war veterans, marched the length of the country to petition the government for the simple right to work. In Italy, Spain, and Germany, they marched to a different drum. With the failure of capitalism, fascism cast its shadow ever wider. John Maynard Keynes saw his nightmare coming true. In Cambridge, Keynes set out to save capitalism from itself by writing a book about what caused the Great Depression and what to do about it. He aimed to rewrite the rules of economics, to see a country's economy as a whole, as a machine that could be managed.
Keynes was the real inventor of macroeconomics. Concepts we take for granted today, like gross domestic product, the level of unemployment, the rate of inflation, all to do with general features of the economy, were invented by him.
He was writing a book which he thought would revolutionise the way we thought about economic systems, but it would also give us the means to make sure that they operated better.
It was written against the background of not only the collapse of the world economy, but the potential collapse of democratic government. Hitler became Chancellor of Germany in 1933. Democracy seemed to be losing ground, and with democracy, the system of liberty. So Keynes had to produce an answer to the Great Depression, or democracy would be swamped by totalitarianism.
The new American president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was staring economic disaster in the face. His wife, Eleanor, described Inauguration Day as very, very solemn and a little terrifying.
This great nation will endure as it has endured, will revive and will prosper.
Roosevelt's voice of confidence rallied the nation. He then embarked on a whirlwind program of reform.
For Roosevelt and the New Deal, it wasn't war. They were at war with the Great Depression. And they responded with frenetic activity, relief programs for the unemployed, for the hungry, programs to get people back to work. They built dams and highways and national parks. At the same time, they instituted a program of regulating capitalism in a way that had never been done before in order to protect people from what they saw as the recklessness of the unfettered market.
Privately, Roosevelt feared the market system had failed. So he created an entire alphabet of new agencies to regulate banks, the stock market, capitalism itself. New headquarters built for the Interstate Commerce Commission celebrated government regulation, which reined in market forces and curbed capitalism. Under the New Deal, industry became subject to a host of new rules and regulations.
And the airline industry was a very good example of that. You'd have people that go into this business, be very competitive, they'd go bankrupt, new people would come in, they would go bankrupt, it was very unstable. So the New Deal stepped in and said, we're going to stabilize this industry, we're going to set the prices that you can charge for tickets, we're going to tell you what routes you can fly. And with that system, they eliminated these very vicious cycles of boom and bust in the aviation industry, and in a sense, that was what they were aiming to do throughout the American economy.
In 1936, John Maynard Keynes finally published his General Theory, a brilliant analysis of how to fight the Depression. By showing governments that it was possible to manage their economies, Keynes made himself the most influential economist of the age.
Keynes' solution to the unemployment was for the government to spend the money and restore and maintain full employment.
Government, said Keynes, should spend against the wind. In good times, they should reduce their spending and build surpluses. In bad times, like the Great Depression, they should step up spending, run deficits, and put purchasing power into the hands of working people.
He gave people hope that unemployment could be cured without concentration camps.
Harvard University became an intellectual bridgehead for Keynes in America. John Kenneth Galbraith was one of Keynes' leading apostles.
I've said many times I think had something, maybe quite a bit, to do with bringing Keynes across the Atlantic. I came back to find a whole group of people here who had also read the General Theory, and this was a breath of hope and optimism.
In Washington, Keynes' ideas would begin to turn economics policy upside down. Governments would learn to live with a little inflation to keep unemployment low.
You resisted conservative finance, borrowed money, and hired people across the country, rescuing them from unemployment. That was the basic essential. And that you didn't worry about accumulating debt. Or more precisely, you worried about it but did it anyway.
Keynes' ideas began to gain ground. It took a world war for Keynesianism to become government policy. As the U.S. government borrowed money and pumped it into the war effort, high unemployment ended and the Depression disappeared.
Men and women to make the uniforms, machinists to make the guns and ammunition, auto workers to produce the jeeps and trucks, to build the ships and tanks, civilian soldiers to turn out the fighters, the bombers.
In charge of wartime wage and price controls, John Kenneth Galbraith saw the economy rebound.
One could not have had a better demonstration of the Keynesian ideas. And I think it's fair to say that as a young Keynesian in Washington, in touch with the other Keynesians there, we all saw that very clearly at the time.
In a radio broadcast, Keynes expressed his hope that what worked in war would work in peace.
If expenditure on armaments really does cure unemployment, the grand experiment has begun. Good may come out of evil. We may learn a trick or two which will come in useful when the day of peace comes.
Now teaching at the London School of Economics, Hayek feared that Keynes' Brave New World was a big step in the wrong direction. He attacked the growing consensus by writing The Road to Serfdom. Sarcastically dedicated to socialists of all parties, it was a popular success. There was even a cartoon version of it. Its message was simple and direct. Too much government planning means too much government power. And too much government power over the economy destroys freedom and makes men slaves. For Hayek, central planning was the first step to a totalitarian state.
Well, Hayek thought that since freedom was an absolute, you must let a competitive system just work itself out. And if at times that meant there was considerable unemployment, well, that's what you had to put up with.
Hayek always rejected macroeconomics. He rejected any government intervention during the Great Depression itself. Whereas Keynes was an activist, said in the long run we're all dead. And in the long run, if we allow things to go on without remedy, we get lots of Hitlers, lots of wars, lots of Stalins. Now, who was right?
Most people would have agreed with Keynes when he wrote this to Hayek.
What we want is not no planning or even less planning. We almost certainly want more.
In the battle of ideas, Hayek was on the losing side.
I had a fairly good reputation as an economic theorist in 1944 when I published The Road to Serfdom. And it was treated, even by the academic community, very largely as a malicious effort by a reactionary to destroy high ideals.
With the world at war, Keynes traveled to Bretton Woods and a Grand Resort hotel. Here, delegates gathered from all over the world to organize the post-war economy. The Bretton Woods Conference created the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. They were designed to bring stability to the world economy and prevent the unemployment and the depression of the 1930s. Keynes' idealism and humanity were an inspiration.
There has never been such a far-reaching proposal on so great a scale to provide employment in the present and increase productivity in the future. And I doubt if the world yet understands how big a thing we are bringing to birth.
Keynes did not have long to live. Ill and overworked, his health gave way, but his reputation and influence outlived him.
When Keynes died, Keynes and I were the best-known economists. Then two things happened. Keynes died and was raised to sainthood, and I discredited myself for publishing The Road to Serfdom. And that changed the situation completely. And for the following 30 years, it was only Keynes who counted, and I was gradually almost forgotten.
The war was over, and the troops came marching home. The final summit conference of the three wartime allies took place in a palace in the Berlin suburb of Potsdam. Truman, Churchill, and Stalin came to plan the peace and to redraw the map of Europe. Their different economic systems offered alternative paths to prosperity, but the Great Depression continued to cast its long shadow.
There's no doubt that at the end of World War II, there was a tremendous loss of faith in the market economy. You had a feeling in large parts of the world, we don't want to go that way. We want to go a better way.
In Britain, the troops were coming home to a general election.
Well, I came back in a troop ship in the summer of 1945. I was a pilot in the Royal Air Force, and I was picked as a 19-year-old to be the Labour candidate. All these soldiers all said, never again, we're never going back to unemployment, Great Depression, to fascism, to rearmament. We want to build a new society.
During the dark war years, Britain had been governed by a coalition of conservatives and socialists. Winston Churchill, the great wartime leader and head of the Conservative Party, expected an easy victory. Everywhere he went, huge crowds turned out to cheer the nation's hero. Heading the campaign against Churchill was Clement Attlee, leader of the Labour Party. Attlee argued that Britain had planned the war, and now planning would win the peace.
We knew our people would never have withstood the bombardments and the loss of life and the hardship if they hadn't been confident that their government was operating a policy of fair shares. We set out to ensure this system of fair shares under planning and controls continued after the war.
Churchill, who was influenced by Hayek's book, The Road to Serfdom, opposed planning and controls.
No socialist system can be established without a political police, some form of Gestapo.
He got carried away with this Gestapo. And this, of course, it was carried to absurdity, Gestapo, in Britain.
Attlee, a mild-mannered Christian socialist, gave Churchill's gaffe a sinister spin.
Attlee actually went out of his way to refer to this foreign professor with this Friedrich August von Hayek, this foreign chap with a slightly German accent.
Britain went to the polls. The result was sensational.
Here is the state parties up to 3 o'clock in detail. Conservatives, 180. Labour, 364.
Churchill was out. The people had voted for a new socialist Britain.
The Labour Party swept apart simply because the vast majority of people, particularly those men and women in the fighting forces who lived through the dreadful depression years of the 30s, just said, Churchill's done a fine job of war leader, but we don't trust him to win the peace.
What kind of society do you want?
Attlee promised his party that they would build a new Jerusalem.
Let's go forward into this fight in the spirit of William Blake. I will not cease from mental fight, nor shall the sword sleep in my hand, till we have built Jerusalem in England's green and pleasant land.
William Blake's hymn, Jerusalem, became an anthem for the labor movement.
You know, it seemed to people who'd been through a war, it seemed to them natural justice. Why not pool your resources? And so we broke into the concept of the sacredness of private property.
When labor took power, private owners were compelled to sell their businesses. Labor created a mixed economy in which newly nationalized industries coexisted with private enterprise. Now, government-owned industries like coal, rail, and steel no longer enriched owners and shareholders, but worked for the common good.
So it was an act of regeneration, of renewal. That was the hope. And it was a hope that gave us the welfare state, gave us the National Health Service, gave us full employment, gave us trade union rights, really rebuilt the country from the bottom up.
The welfare state provided care, free of charge, from womb to tomb. Nobody, rich or poor, would need to fear poverty, ignorance, unemployment, ill health, or old age.
And people said, this is better than allowing a lot of gamblers to run the world where they're not interested in us, but only in profit.
Russia ended the war as a military and industrial giant. With the Red Army and the secret police, Stalin imposed his economic system on half of Europe.
The planned economy of Lenin and Stalin had defeated fascism. Scientific socialism seemed to be in the ascendancy.
Socialism was on the march. Capitalism and free markets were on the retreat.
So about 1/3 of the world adopted socialism, sometimes through internal revolution, sometimes through brutal imposition by the Red Army.
The world was divided. The Cold War had begun.
Okay, well, we'll stop here. Okay, I don't want to. Switzerland in 1947.
But he...
Anybody write down that Switzerland in 1947? Okay, so we will continue next class. Okay, and next class I'm going to bring a DVD, so you'll have better experience watching this. Okay, but how do you guys like it so far? It's interesting, right? Okay, and class is dismissed.